You can replace a wife, Daniel, someone whispered behind the champagne glasses, but you can't replace history. The ballroom shimmered in gold light and quiet ambition as Daniel Whitmore stepped onto the marble stage with his hand resting confidently at the small of Chloe Bennett's back, her silver gown catching every flash of the cameras like a blade of moonlight. And somewhere in the crowd, 10 yards away, stood Evelyn Carter, still enough to be mistaken for a sculpture, her black silk dress absorbing the glow rather than reflecting it, as if she had learned long ago that true power did not need to shine. The string quartet played something elegant and forgettable while waiters drifted through the room with trays of sparkling water and imported champagne, and Daniel's voice carried easily over the soft hum of conversation as he introduced Chloe as the face of his company's new era, the symbol of forward motion, the woman who inspired him to dream bigger than he ever had before, and the applause rose in polite waves, cresting and falling like the tide along a California shoreline. Evelyn did not clap, did not move, did not even blink when Chloe's bright laugh rang out like a bell announcing the end of something sacred. She simply watched the man she had once shared a quiet townhouse with in Boston become a stranger beneath a spotlight he had always chased, and in that moment she realized the room smelled the same as every other gala she had attended in the last decade, a mix of expensive cologne, polished wood, and fragile ambition. Daniel caught sight of her briefly as he lifted a crystal flute in celebration, and for a fraction of a second his smile faltered. But then he turned back toward the cameras, toward the model whose future he believed was as limitless as his own, and the world kept spinning as if nothing had changed at all. Evelyn left before dessert was served, walking past the valet stand into the cool night air that carried the distant sound of taxis and river traffic, and the city lights stretched before her like a promise she had not yet decided to keep. Her heels clicking softly against the pavement as she stepped into a waiting black sedan without a word, while inside the ballroom Daniel Whitmore toasted to reinvention, unaware that somewhere high above the Hudson a single phone call was already being placed, and that by morning the glittering future he had just unveiled would begin to quietly unravel. By sunrise the headlines had already shifted in ways Daniel Whitmore could not understand as he stood in the floor-to-ceiling glass office on the 42nd story of his downtown tower, the Hudson River glinting like cold steel beneath a pale winter sun, while his phone vibrated relentlessly against the marble desk, each notification another quiet crack in the perfect image he had unveiled the night before. Chloe Bennett was supposed to be on a private flight to Los Angeles for a luxury campaign that would cement her as the most sought-after face of the season. Yet the message from her agent was brief and strangely formal. The brand had decided to pursue a different direction, and within the hour 2 more contracts evaporated in the same polite language of sudden scheduling conflicts and strategic reevaluations, words that sounded harmless until they began to stack up like sealed doors in a narrowing hallway. Daniel told himself it was a coincidence, that markets were unpredictable, that reputations were built on resilience. But he could not ignore the subtle shift in tone from investors who had once laughed too loudly at his jokes and now spoke with measured pauses, as though listening for something he could not hear. Across the city in a quiet conference room overlooking the river, Evelyn Carter sat at the head of a long walnut table where sunlight pooled like liquid gold across leather portfolios and half-finished cups of black coffee, her reflection faint in the window behind the skyline. She had learned to navigate without needing to conquer, and when the senior partner of a private equity firm greeted her with a respectful nod and called her the architect of their latest acquisition strategy, she responded with the same calm smile she had worn the night before when she slipped unnoticed into the waiting sedan, because she understood that power was rarely loud and never rushed. Meanwhile, Chloe wandered through a midtown showroom that suddenly felt too bright, too hollow, the mirrors catching fragments of uncertainty she had never practiced hiding, her stylist offering reassurances that sounded rehearsed while assistants avoided her gaze. And somewhere deep inside the industry, an invisible ledger was being rewritten line by line, one quiet decision at a time. Daniel began dialing numbers that usually opened doors before the second ring. Yet this morning calls rolled to voicemail and text messages lingered unanswered. And as he paced the length of his office, he noticed how the city outside continued with its ordinary rhythm of honking taxis and hurried pedestrians as if the foundation beneath his success was not shifting inch by inch. That afternoon, he received an invitation to an exclusive financial summit hosted in a glass tower on the opposite side of the river, the kind of event reserved for visionaries and legacy builders. And he accepted immediately, believing instinctively that somewhere in those polished corridors he would find an explanation for the strange silence closing in around him, never suspecting that the woman he had once dismissed as part of his past was already seated several floors above, reviewing documents with the steady confidence of someone who no longer needed permission to shape the future. The financial summit unfolded like a carefully staged performance in a tower of mirrored glass rising nearly 600 feet above the river, its lobby humming with the low, confident murmur of wealth and ambition, while Daniel Whitmore adjusted his cuff links and reminded himself that success was simply a matter of timing and perception. The elevators opened onto a reception hall washed in soft amber light, where executives moved in quiet constellations around displays of innovation and growth. Projections, and for a fleeting moment he believed he could still steer the narrative back in his favor, that the subtle tremors of the past 48 hours were nothing more than passing static in a career defined by decisive victories. Across the room, a familiar silhouette caught his attention, a woman standing beside a floor-to-ceiling window with the skyline spread behind her like an unfinished painting. And when she turned slightly, the reflection fractured into two images that seemed to belong to different lives. The composed investor who commanded attention without raising her voice, and the memory of the partner he had once underestimated, and the realization settled over him like the slow descent of evening. Evelyn Carter listened as a venture capitalist outlined a strategic merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars, her gaze steady, her tone measured. And when she spoke, the room leaned closer as though drawn by an invisible current, because she no longer needed to prove she belonged in spaces that had once excluded her. She simply occupied them with the quiet assurance of someone who had rebuilt her identity piece by careful piece. Daniel approached with the faint confidence of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes. Yet each step felt heavier than the last, as he noticed how conversations paused and eyes followed her rather than him. How introductions were offered to her first as chairwoman of a consortium, shaping the direction of entire industries, and how the invitation he had accepted so eagerly was in fact an entry into a world she now defined. Somewhere beyond the glass walls, the river traffic traced thin white lines across the darkening water, while messages continued to arrive on his phone, updates about lost partnerships and delayed funding cycles. Each notification a reminder that influence could shift overnight without warning. When their eyes finally met, there was no accusation in hers. No triumph either. Only the calm recognition that time had rearranged their positions on the same board. And Daniel understood with a clarity that felt almost merciful that the story he believed he was writing had long since been edited by forces he never noticed. The summit continued with speeches and measured applause. Yet for him the atmosphere had changed completely, as though the building itself had tilted slightly off its axis. And when Evelyn turned back to the window, the city lights reflected in the glass like constellations mapping a future he could no longer predict, leaving him to wonder whether reinvention was ever truly within his control, or if he had simply mistaken visibility for power all along. The summit ended in a slow dissolve of polite handshakes and curated smiles. Yet the echo of Evelyn Carter's quiet authority lingered in Daniel Whitmore's thoughts long after he stepped into the private car that carried him back across the bridge, the city skyline stretching for nearly 3 miles in a jagged line of light that once felt like a personal promise and now resembled an unfinished equation he could no longer solve. His reflection in the tinted window looked unfamiliar, the confident executive replaced by a man calculating risks he had never anticipated, while his assistant's voice filtered through the speakerphone with careful restraint, explaining that several board members had requested an emergency review of the company's funding strategy, their concerns framed in language that sounded professional yet unmistakably distant. Across town, high above the hum of evening traffic, Evelyn stood in a softly lit office where the air smelled faintly of cedar and fresh paper, studying projections that outlined the next phase of an investment initiative designed to reshape entire markets over the next 5 years. And when a junior analyst asked how she remained so composed amid such rapid change, she answered with a small, measured smile, explaining that resilience was not a reaction but a discipline learned one deliberate step at a time. Chloe Bennett, meanwhile, walked alone through a quiet studio space where racks of unused garments cast long shadows under fluorescent lights, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of a freight elevator. And she began to understand that fame could fade as quickly as it arrived when it was built on borrowed influence rather than enduring substance. Daniel arrived at his office to find the glass conference room filled with muted tension, executives seated around a table that seemed suddenly too long, their expressions careful as they discussed new regulatory pressures and shifting alliances that threatened to slow the momentum he had once considered unstoppable. And for the first time he listened rather than led, sensing that the architecture of success was far more fragile than he had ever admitted. Later that night, as rain traced thin silver lines down the windows of his penthouse nearly 500 feet above the streets, he replayed the moment he had seen Evelyn framed against the skyline, realizing that the distance between them was no longer measured in years or miles, but in vision, in patience, in the quiet accumulation of influence he had overlooked. Across the river, she closed her laptop and stepped onto a balcony where the wind carried the distant sound of ferry horns and late-night conversations drifting up from the sidewalks below. And she allowed herself a brief pause, not to celebrate or regret, but simply to acknowledge that the future was unfolding exactly as she had intended, one calm decision at a time, leaving Daniel to wonder whether the empire he had built could withstand a storm that did not announce itself with thunder, but arrived instead as a subtle shift in the balance of power. Morning arrived without ceremony, a pale gray light spilling between the skyscrapers and settling over the city like a quiet verdict while Daniel Whitmore sat alone at the long walnut table in his conference room, watching digital charts flicker across a 12-foot screen that once represented nothing but upward momentum, and now resembled a landscape of hesitation and unanswered questions. The board members spoke in careful tones about liquidity and perception, about market confidence measured not only in dollars but in trust, and he realized how quickly admiration could transform into distance when uncertainty began to gather like fog along a familiar shoreline. Across the river, Evelyn Carter moved through her schedule with the precision of someone who understood that influence was not declared but demonstrated. Pausing briefly in a corner office where sunlight filtered through sheer curtains and illuminated framed architectural sketches that reminded her how foundations were always laid in silence long before towers rose into the sky, and when she signed a document authorizing the acquisition of a mid-sized technology firm, she did so without hesitation, aware that each signature redrew the map of the future in subtle ways most observers would never notice. Chloe Bennett stepped onto a quiet street in Soho carrying a garment bag that felt heavier than its contents, the autumn air cool against her skin as pedestrians hurried past with coffee cups and folded newspapers, and she caught her reflection in a storefront window, wondering when confidence had been replaced by uncertainty and whether she had mistaken visibility for permanence in a world that celebrated both until it did not. Daniel later stood in his penthouse nearly 500 feet above the restless grid of traffic lights and streaming headlights, his gaze tracing the distant outline of the glass tower where he had seen Evelyn command a room without raising her voice. And he began to understand that success could no longer be measured by applause alone, but by the quiet alignment of decisions made far from public stages. Somewhere below, a ferry horn sounded across the darkening water as evening gathered along the riverbanks, and Evelyn closed her laptop before stepping onto her balcony, the wind carrying the faint rhythm of the city's endless motion while she allowed herself a single moment of stillness, not to savor victory or regret the past, but to acknowledge the steady unfolding of a future she had built through patience rather than spectacle. Leaving Daniel to consider whether reinvention was truly about replacing what had been lost or learning, too late, that the strongest empires were shaped by those who understood when to remain unseen. The following week unfolded like a slow-turning tide as Daniel Whitmore arrived at his headquarters before sunrise, the lobby still quiet except for the distant hum of climate control and the faint scent of polished stone lingering in the air, and he paused beneath the vaulted glass ceiling, remembering when this building had felt like a monument to certainty rather than a question waiting to be answered. The city beyond the revolving doors stretched nearly 8 miles in every direction, restless and indifferent, while his phone displayed a calendar filled with strategy sessions and investor calls that now carried an unfamiliar undertone of urgency, as though time itself had begun measuring his decisions with a stricter hand. Across the river, Evelyn Carter moved through a sunlit conference suite where the morning light reflected off chrome fixtures and minimalist artwork, her voice calm as she outlined a 5-year expansion plan that would reposition their consortium at the center of emerging markets. And when a senior advisor commented on her ability to anticipate disruption, she responded with a thoughtful pause, explaining that resilience was less about predicting storms and more about learning to read the subtle changes in the wind long before the first cloud appeared. Chloe Bennett sat in a small cafe on the Upper West Side, watching steam rise from a cup of coffee she had barely touched, while pedestrians hurried past in coats and scarves, and she realized how quickly public fascination could transform into silence when attention shifted elsewhere, leaving her to reconsider what kind of future she wanted to build beyond camera flashes and fleeting headlines. Daniel spent the afternoon reviewing reports that described delayed partnerships and cautious market sentiment, each page reinforcing the sense that the foundation of his empire was being quietly renegotiated by forces operating far beyond his direct influence. And as dusk settled over the skyline, he found himself standing once more at the panoramic window of his penthouse nearly 500 feet above the river, the glow of fairy lights tracing patient arcs across the dark water, while distant traffic murmured like an unanswered question. On a terrace overlooking the same horizon, Evelyn closed a folder embossed with the insignia of a newly acquired firm and allowed herself a brief breath of cool evening air, aware that transformation rarely announced itself with grand gestures, but instead revealed its presence through the steady accumulation of decisions made in private rooms, leaving Daniel to confront the possibility that the story he believed he controlled was being rewritten in real time by someone who understood that true power did not demand recognition to reshape the future. Rain began just before dawn, tapping softly against the wide glass panels of Daniel Whitmore's office as he stood alone in the muted blue light of early morning, watching the river move like a slow current of memory beneath the skyline. And he realized that uncertainty no longer arrived as a sudden shock, but as a quiet accumulation of details he could no longer ignore. The quarterly projections on his screen stretched across 12 feet of glowing numbers that once promised effortless expansion. Yet now they told a subtler story of hesitation and recalibration. And as he traced the shifting lines with his eyes, he thought of the moment he had first believed success could be engineered through image alone, a belief that now felt almost naive. Across the city, Evelyn Carter stepped into a private boardroom where the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with polished leather and ambition, her presence steady as she reviewed a portfolio of acquisitions that extended across several states and into emerging international markets. And when a colleague remarked on the speed of her ascent, she answered with a thoughtful calm, explaining that what appeared sudden to outsiders was often the result of years measured not in applause, but in preparation. Chloe Bennett walked along a quiet stretch of Riverside Park, the wind lifting strands of her hair as joggers passed in steady rhythm, and the distant sound of fairy horns drifted over the water, and she wondered how long it would take to rediscover herself beyond the expectations that had once defined her public image, the city around her continuing its relentless motion as though inviting her to begin again. Daniel spent the afternoon meeting with advisors who spoke in cautious language about restructuring timelines and restoring confidence, their voices echoing gently in the high-ceilinged conference room while sunlight faded into the warm glow of evening. And for the first time he listened without interruption, sensing that leadership might require a different kind of strength than the one he had always displayed. As night settled over the skyline, nearly 8 miles wide in shimmering constellations of light, Evelyn stepped onto a balcony overlooking the river, the cool air carrying the faint music of traffic and late conversations rising from the streets below. And she allowed herself a single moment of reflection, not to measure victory, but to acknowledge the distance she had traveled in silence, leaving Daniel standing at his own window nearly 500 feet above the restless city, wondering whether the empire he had built could adapt to a future shaped by someone who understood that the most decisive transformations rarely announced themselves until it was far too late to reverse them. Autumn sunlight arrived in narrow bands between the towers of downtown Manhattan, painting long shadows across the polished floor of Daniel Whitmore's office as he stood motionless beside the panoramic window nearly 500 feet above the restless grid of streets, watching yellow taxis weave through traffic like fragments of a life he no longer fully controlled. And he realized with a quiet clarity that influence did not disappear all at once, but receded gradually, like a tide pulling back from the shore without asking permission. The weekly leadership briefing unfolded around him in measured voices and digital slides stretching across a 12-foot display, each statistic revealing subtle shifts in confidence that could not be solved by charisma alone, while investors who once praised his instincts now spoke in cautious phrases about sustainability and long-term positioning, their expressions composed yet unmistakably distant. Across the river, Evelyn Carter moved through a glass-walled conference suite where the skyline reflected in geometric patterns against chrome fixtures and minimalist art, her schedule unfolding with the steady rhythm of intention as she reviewed expansion proposals spanning multiple states and emerging technology sectors. And when a young associate asked how she navigated uncertainty, she answered with a soft certainty that resilience was built through consistency rather than spectacle, a philosophy she had carried with her since the days when she was dismissed as merely supportive rather than strategic. Chloe Bennett spent the afternoon inside a modest studio in Brooklyn, where the scent of fresh paint lingered in the air and sunlight spilled through high industrial windows, experimenting with a new creative direction that felt both unfamiliar and strangely liberating. And as she adjusted a simple canvas backdrop, she began to understand that reinvention required patience as much as ambition, the city beyond the brick walls continuing its relentless motion as though encouraging her to redefine success on her own terms. Daniel later found himself walking alone along the river promenade, the wind carrying the distant echo of fairy horns and laughter drifting from rooftop gatherings nearly a mile away, and he wondered whether the foundation of his empire could be reshaped before the quiet changes around him solidified into permanence, his reflection flickering briefly in the dark surface of the water like a question he had not yet learned to answer. That evening Evelyn stepped onto a balcony overlooking the same horizon, the lights of the skyline stretching nearly 8 miles into the distance like constellations guiding a future she had envisioned long before anyone else noticed its outline. And she allowed herself a single, steady breath of cool air, aware that the most decisive transformations often unfolded without applause, leaving Daniel to confront the possibility that the story he believed he had written for himself was now being revised by forces that valued foresight over display, and that the next chapter would depend not on reclaiming what had been lost, but on understanding what power truly meant in a world that rewarded those who knew how to remain calm, while everything else quietly changed. The city shifted toward winter with a quiet determination that matched the steady evolution of events unfolding behind glass walls and closed doors as Daniel Whitmore stepped into a board meeting where the air felt heavier than usual, the polished oak table stretching nearly 20 feet beneath recessed lights that cast careful shadows across faces once eager to align themselves with his ambition. And he sensed the subtle recalibration in their tone before anyone spoke a single word: financial. Projections were displayed in crisp columns across a 12-foot digital screen, yet the numbers now carried a different kind of gravity, reflecting markets that no longer responded to charisma alone, but demanded resilience and foresight. And as the discussion turned toward contingency planning, Daniel listened with an unfamiliar humility, realizing that the confidence he had built over years could not substitute for the quiet authority he had recently witnessed from a woman who had learned to move without announcing her intentions. Across the river, Evelyn Carter reviewed final drafts of a strategic partnership inside a sunlit office, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed a skyline that stretched nearly 8 miles into the distance. Her voice calm as she guided a team of advisors through scenarios that balanced risk with long-term vision. And when one executive remarked on the elegance of her approach, she smiled gently, explaining that influence was not measured by how loudly one spoke, but by how consistently one prepared for the future. Chloe Bennett spent the afternoon arranging sample prints in a modest Brooklyn studio where the scent of fresh canvas and roasted coffee mingled in the air, her movements deliberate as she experimented with creative concepts that felt both unfamiliar and authentic. And for the first time in months, she sensed the possibility of building a life defined not by fleeting attention, but by enduring purpose. Daniel later walked along a quiet stretch of riverfront nearly a mile from his tower. The cold wind carrying the distant sound of ferry engines and laughter from rooftop gatherings. And he wondered whether reinvention required relinquishing the image he had carefully constructed in order to discover what remained when applause faded into memory. That evening Evelyn stood on her balcony, watching the lights ripple across the dark water, like constellations guiding unseen travelers, aware that the most decisive shifts often occurred without spectacle, and as she closed the door behind her, she knew that the coming weeks would reveal whether the empire Daniel believed he still commanded could adapt to a future shaped by patience rather than display, leaving him alone beneath a skyline that no longer reflected certainty, but possibility. Winter settled fully over the city with a crisp clarity that sharpened both ambition and doubt as Daniel Whitmore stepped into a private investor reception held nearly 60 stories above the river. The ballroom illuminated by crystal chandeliers that scattered reflections across marble floors like fragments of a future he could no longer fully predict. And he moved through the room with the composed confidence he had spent years perfecting, even as he sensed the subtle shift in how conversations paused before welcoming him in. Waiters drifted past carrying trays of sparkling water and vintage champagne, while executives spoke in measured tones about market resilience and strategic vision, their words echoing softly against glass walls that framed a skyline, stretching nearly 8 miles into the distance. And Daniel realized that recognition alone was no longer the currency that secured loyalty in a world increasingly shaped by foresight. Across the room, Evelyn Carter stood beside a display outlining the launch of a new innovation fund valued in the hundreds of millions, her presence calm and assured as investors gathered around to listen. And when she spoke about long-term sustainability, her voice carried a quiet authority that drew attention. Without demanding it, the kind of influence that did not rely on spectacle to command respect, Daniel approached with a courteous smile, aware that their paths had converged again in a setting designed to celebrate visionaries. And for a brief moment the hum of conversation seemed to fade as he greeted her with the familiarity of shared history. Yet he sensed how the distance between their lives had become measured not in years, but in perspective, her gaze steady and reflective like the river. Beyond the glass, Chloe Bennett arrived later in the evening wearing a simple tailored suit that reflected her new direction rather than the expectations she once embodied. And as she moved through the crowd, she felt both vulnerable and determined, recognizing that reinvention required stepping into rooms where the past no longer defined the narrative. The event unfolded with speeches and polite applause while city lights shimmered like constellations beneath the dark sky, and Daniel listened carefully as Evelyn was introduced as chairwoman of a consortium shaping emerging markets across multiple states. The acknowledgement delivered with a respect that resonated through the hall more powerfully than any announcement he had ever orchestrated. When he finally stepped onto the balcony overlooking the river nearly 600 feet below, the cold air carried the distant sound of ferry horns and late-night traffic, and he understood with a quiet certainty that the empire he believed he had controlled was entering a chapter he could not script alone, leaving him to consider whether the future would reward those who adapted with humility or those who clung to the illusion of permanence as the city continued its endless motion beneath the winter stars. Snow began to fall in thin silver threads across the city the morning Daniel Whitmore received the report that would change everything, the flakes dissolving against the glass walls of his office nearly 500 feet above the river as he stood with a printed briefing in his hands and realized that several of his company's largest funding pipelines were now controlled by a consortium he could not influence directly. And for the first time in years he felt the quiet weight of consequence settle into the rhythm of his breathing. The boardroom filled slowly with executives whose tailored coats carried the chill of winter inside with them, their expressions composed yet undeniably cautious as projections were displayed. across a 12-foot screen showing strategic realignments and newly emerging partnerships that bore a single unmistakable signature. And Daniel listened in silence as the implications unfolded with clinical precision, understanding that momentum could reverse not through dramatic collapse, but through a gradual redirection of trust. Across town, Evelyn Carter stepped into a formal signing ceremony held in a restored historic building overlooking the harbor nearly 2 miles from her office tower. The air warm with anticipation and the polished oak table reflecting the soft glow of chandelier light. And when she signed the final document completing the acquisition of a major infrastructure firm, her colleagues rose in quiet applause that carried more respect than spectacle, the acknowledgement of influence earned through consistency rather than display. Chloe Bennett watched the moment later on a muted television in a modest design studio, where she had begun collaborating with a small, creative collective, the scent of fresh fabric and strong coffee filling the room as she sketched new concepts that felt grounded in authenticity rather than image. And she sensed that reinvention was less about reclaiming the past than about building something that could endure beyond public fascination. Daniel spent the afternoon moving through corridors that once felt like extensions of his certainty. Now aware that each decision ahead would require humility he had never practiced before. And as dusk settled over the skyline, he found himself standing again at the panoramic window of his penthouse, watching fairy lights trace patient arcs across the dark water. The city stretching nearly 8 miles in shimmering constellations that no longer promised effortless victory, but offered instead a quieter possibility of transformation. On a balcony overlooking the same winter horizon, Evelyn allowed herself a single moment of stillness, snow settling lightly on the rail as she considered the distance she had traveled without raising her voice, leaving Daniel to confront the realization that the narrative he believed he controlled had entered a chapter defined not by who stood in the spotlight, but by who understood how to shape the future from the shadows. The announcement arrived on a clear winter morning when the sky over the river shimmered in pale blue light that felt almost ceremonial, and Daniel Whitmore stood in the quiet stillness of his office reading the formal statement confirming that a sweeping restructuring initiative would place his company into a strategic partnership overseen by a consortium whose influence had grown steadily in recent months. The language measured and respectful, yet unmistakably decisive in its implications. The board gathered within minutes around the long conference table stretching nearly 20 feet beneath soft recessed lighting, their voices calm but deliberate as they discussed pathways forward, and Daniel realized with an unfamiliar clarity that the empire he once directed with instinct and spectacle now required a different kind of leadership rooted in patience and reflection. Across town, Evelyn Carter entered a grand auditorium inside a newly restored financial center overlooking the harbor. Nearly 3 miles from her office tower, the space filled with investors and innovators whose quiet applause rose as she stepped onto the stage to outline a vision focused on sustainable growth and collaborative strength. Her tone steady as she described markets not as battlegrounds, but as ecosystems shaped by foresight. And the respect in the room carried a resonance far deeper than any celebration he had once orchestrated. Chloe Bennett watched the broadcast later from a modest studio in Brooklyn where she had begun mentoring young creatives who valued authenticity over attention. The scent of fabric dye and strong coffee filling the air as she listened to Evelyn speak about reinvention without bitterness. And she understood that the future she was building would not depend on reclaiming a spotlight, but on discovering purpose beyond it. Daniel spent the afternoon walking through the corridors of his headquarters where sunlight reflected off glass partitions in long geometric lines, remembering the certainty that once guided every decision and recognizing that transformation did not erase identity, but refined it through challenge. And as evening settled across the skyline, nearly 8 miles wide in a tapestry of light, he found himself standing once more at the panoramic window of his penthouse, watching ferry boats trace silent paths across the dark water like reminders that direction could change. Without warning, on a balcony overlooking the same horizon, Evelyn closed a folder containing the final approvals for the consortium's new initiative and allowed herself a quiet breath of cold air, aware that influence achieved through resilience would endure long after headlines faded. leaving Daniel to consider whether the next chapter of his life would be defined by resistance to change or by the courage to evolve alongside a world that rewarded those who understood that power was most profound when it was exercised with calm conviction. Spring arrived almost unnoticed, the last traces of winter dissolving into soft rain that blurred the edges of the skyline, as Daniel Whitmore stood once again before the wide glass window of his office, watching sunlight return in hesitant glimmers across the river and realizing that time had continued moving forward regardless of the battles he once believed defined him. The months of restructuring had reshaped his company into something leaner and more collaborative, guided now by partnerships rather than dominance. And as he reviewed the latest reports spread across his desk nearly 3 feet wide, he felt a quiet shift inside himself. An acceptance that leadership was no longer about commanding the spotlight, but about understanding the currents beneath it. Across town, Evelyn Carter walked through the atrium of a newly opened innovation center funded by her consortium. The scent of fresh cedar and polished stone lingering in the warm air, while young entrepreneurs gathered around interactive displays that stretched nearly 10 yards across the hall, their excitement a reminder that influence could nurture as much as it could transform. And when she paused to listen to their ideas, she felt the calm satisfaction of someone who had learned that strength was measured not by what was taken, but by what was built. Chloe Bennett stood beside a row of framed photographs in a small downtown gallery, her first independent exhibition drawing a modest but genuine crowd who spoke about her work with curiosity rather than spectacle, and she realized that reinvention had led her somewhere quieter yet more enduring than the flash of cameras she once chased. That evening, Daniel accepted an invitation to a waterfront reception celebrating new collaborations that would shape the city's future. The venue sat nearly 20 feet above the gently shifting tide where lanterns swayed in the spring breeze and conversations carried across the deck like fragments of possibility. And when he saw Evelyn standing near the railing, he approached not with the urgency of the past, but with a composed gratitude for the lessons they had both learned. They spoke briefly about vision and resilience, about how the skyline stretching nearly 8 miles into the dusk represented not conquest but continuity. And as the lights flickered on across the river, Daniel understood that the story he once feared losing had simply evolved into something he could finally respect. Later, as he watched ferries trace silver paths across the darkening water, he realized that power had never been about replacing what was gone, but about discovering who one could become when silence offered space to grow. While on a balcony overlooking the same horizon, Evelyn allowed herself a final quiet breath, knowing that she had never sought revenge, only peace, and that in the end the world had adjusted itself around the strength she carried without ever needing to raise her voice.